and welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast, the podcast that celebrates the ideal spaces of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I'm your host, Flora and Ulrich, and I'm joined by my co-host and the director of Ideal Spaces, Ulrich Gehmann.
Hello, I'm glad that we are meeting today, and I'm very curious what will be coming out of our conversation.
Well, yes, absolutely, because today we'll be talking to the acclaimed artist and master sculptor, Romolo Del Deo, whose work is very much aligned with our own future-oriented projects at Ideal Spaces. For Ideal Spaces, this ambition focuses around shaping contemporary living spaces that suit human needs. And for Romolo, it involves reskilling and deindustrializing the artistic process to create a blueprint for an alternative future art. After completing degrees at Harvard and the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence, Romolo turned away from his early successes and the artistic trends of the late 20th century. He anticipated that there would come a time when we would be saturated with disposable and ill-made things. While everyone else was racing to define the moment, Romolo dedicated himself to an art that expressed the eternal, an enduring art for the new millennium, which he describes as long art. Romolo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Flora, and thank you, Ulrich. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, your approach to sculpture and the world around us is really fascinating, and I can't wait to talk to you about it in more detail. I thought as a good starting point, we could talk about your recent sculpture installation at the Venice Art Biennale. So it's a 3-meter sculpture entitled The Tree of Life, which is ours, and it's on display at the European Cultural Centre Pavilion until November. From my point of view, it seems to be a great example of your approach to long art, and it makes a real statement about industrialised, mass-produced processes and products. What was your inspiration behind this work?
Well, thank you. Actually, there were a number of different threads. I think that one of the key things about any successful artwork is that it is not rooted entirely in just one thing, that diverse threads should be interwoven together, ideally even things that seem unrelated, but it is the artist's job to show how everything is connected and to make a statement that unifies disparate elements. In this case, a number of things happen in the piece. I, of course, as are we all, very concerned about the threat of sea level rise to Venice. It is an extraordinarily beautiful place, and it is one that is facing an existential battle to survive and endure in the face of rising sea level. This battle between the forces of industrialization, which essentially want to exploit without cognizance of impact, and the forces of preservation and culture and environmental awareness, which seek to find a balance so that we can continue to survive and endure in this world without destroying it at our use. So I was fortunate to be given a site in the gorgeous seafront garden filled with pine trees. And they're rather extraordinary pine trees. They're really gorgeous sculptures in and of themselves. And this is partly because of the seawater that keeps on rising in Venice and the trees' reaction to it. What these trees are doing to escape the sea level rise is that they extend their roots back away from the waterfront towards this little park. And in so doing, they tip themselves over so that when you go to this park and you look at it, it impresses upon you all of these trees at about 45 degrees angle, pointing towards the water itself, which is very anomalous. And so the trees are full of these beautiful knotted forms. And they're Italian pines, which are expressive and textural to begin with. And I looked at them and I saw incredible inspiration. And I went back to where I'm working in Provincetown and in Pietrasanta, which are two seacoast communities. And I looked at the trees around me. And one of the things that we are also witnessing in effect from sea level rise is a phenomenon called ghost forests. And ghost forests are created when, again, the sea level rise rises up in the groundwater, and it generally attacks the hardwood forest first. And the large hardwood trees like oaks, they become desiccated, filled with salt, and they die. They become these white skeletal trees. And we now have large tracts of forest which are dead. This is a manifestation that transcends a moment in time and makes clear what is going on in a way that's very, very visual. So as part of my art practice, I generally like to gather natural objects and found things from the beach. We call it beachcombing. And I love to do this. I find the forms are quite expressive. We have a poet here. His name is Harry Kemp. He was sort of turn of the century, great poet of nature. And he would also walk the beach and collecting forms. And he always said that these pieces of wood that he found on the beach, that every piece of driftwood contained the soul of a creature. And so I am out there collecting these pieces of driftwood, which are coming out of these ghost forests now in abundance, and gathering them back to my studio. And I started working with them. I wanted to connect these things, these elements of environmental science and testament to issues of global warming with, let's say, really the storytelling aspect of Greco-Roman antiquity. And in the case of this piece that I was trying to create for the Biennale, I once again looked to Greco-Roman mythology to find something that could really tie together this message I felt about the connection we have with forests. And when I thought about it, the myth of Daphne seemed the most appropriate and really telling thing, where Daphne, she's hit with an arrow of repulsion, and Apollo is hit with an arrow of love, and he can't live without her. She can't live with him. She seeks to escape him, and to escape him, she becomes a tree. And I thought, wow, there it all is, because we are actually all Daphne. We are all trees. We are connected to trees. Our lives are intertwined. This makes a perfect way to connect these dying trees, these beautiful forms, these, as this poet Harry Kemp would say, these pieces of driftwood with a soul, to an actual expression of a mythological soul which is embedded in a tree. And it creates this entire ensemble, which also, for me, metaphorically and literally, really embodies what I'm trying to do in long art, which is connect traditional ideas about making art and the motival ideas with the exigencies and the necessities of our present environmental crisis, of really using art as a platform to talk about what we are confronting in climate change and sea level rise and all of these different matters. And doing that not just through messaging of what the piece is about, but actually doing that in the way we go about making the pieces, which is just as important.
That's a very good point, because my question is why you termed your entire approach long art. What distinguishes long art from the mainstream of today's art? And in this respect, why long art as a movement?
Well, one of the things about art making is that it has become, over the last century, very attached to innovation. And innovation is extremely important. It's necessary. Artists have always wanted to be innovators and creators and inventors of new things, new ideas, new ways of looking at the world, new ways of presenting us with looking at the world. However, as an end in and of itself, innovation is lacking. And I often like to make the analogy with food, that what makes a meal sustaining and healthy is not its speed with which it can be served to you. And a lot of times in that context, there is actually an inverse ratio of speed to health and nutrition. In Italy, particularly, there's been a culture that's sprung up called slow food, where they emphasize the artisanal heirloom materials, natural materials, taking time to make things, making things with pure, locally sourced ingredients, as opposed to things that come out of mass market And I have been very inspired by this movement. And I have, in a way, brought it into the art making process. Long art is about using heirloom practices, naturally occurring materials, a lot of the techniques and methods that were used for thousands of years, which have amply proved themselves to be incredibly sustainable, but have in the last half century been almost entirely replaced by industrialized products, synthetics, analogs for these traditional materials, which often are neither easier to work with nor actually produce better results. One of the things that artists don't realize is that most art supplies you would find in the store now are essentially bad imitations of what artists have used for hundreds of years. And they're often given the same names, but these names are actually misleading. And it's not necessary. It's just that in the 20th century, the petrochemical industry looked for available niche markets to expand into. And they first attacked large-scale production, things like house paints, things like that. And then they refined these products to also penetrate fine art and hobbyists and other niche markets, and slowly displaced all of our natural materials with these artificial materials, which are either toxic for the environment, toxic for the artist, or both.
It's interesting to hear you speaking about materials, because I also wondered whether sculpture in particular is suited to long art, because I get the sense that compared to painting or drawing, for instance, that it can't be done quickly. It's a process of careful refinement, consideration, and therefore perhaps better suited to that idea of spending a long time thinking rather than rushing through, as you mentioned, with the slow food.
Yes, well, sculpture certainly can be that. It can be the result of a long process, but I think there's ample evidence to the contrary in the last 100 years of sculpture, which is as improvisational in nature as anything in two-dimensional art. So that is not inherently part of what sculpture is now. But I really, in long art, I don't want to get into litigating whether or not that's good. I think everything does have its place. I think that one of the things I admire in a lot of contemporary art is the spirit of innovation. And one of the things that I bemoan in a lot of art which works traditionally is its lack of innovation and its really unimaginative rehashing of ideas that were abandoned 200 years ago. These ideas about working are wonderful. These elements of composition, of thinking, of rooting things in past culture are incredible artistic tools. But to slavishly just go through the motions of repeating the French Academy is an empty exercise, in my opinion. It doesn't speak to where we are now. In order for us to use that information, to use those ideas, to use those methods, we have to be 21st century artists, to reincorporate all of those things into our lives today, to speak to us.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, which leads me to my next question as regards the relation between art and the community in general, and in specific, the relation between art and public space. In traditional pre-modern art, in the widest sense, many pieces of art have been explicitly designed for public spaces to be viewed in public by communities of people. How would you see this relation between art, public space, and community? How you would see this relation from the background of your long art approach, and especially between community and public space?
I think it's an incredibly important activity for communities. Public art activates spaces and activates people in those spaces. But the issue of long art and public art is also more nuanced, and there are things about it that I'm hoping become more considered. One of the problems that we see with a lot of public art is that it looks great for 5, maybe even 10 years, and then it really begins to look bedraggled. This is unfortunate, but it's a fact of fabrication. It's a fact of how work is made. and the processes and the materials that are frequently used nowadays, that they do not have what I call a long, sustainable half-life without significant support. And I use this term of carbon half-life to describe the impacts of artwork, because frequently it's thrown at me, well, how can you pretend to be green in your art making when you are, firing big forms and melting metal, and this is very energy intensive? And yes, it is very true, it is. However, should you work in these traditional materials of, say, bronze or marble or terracotta, whatever the energy expenditure at the beginning, at the creation point of the artwork, it has a hump, a high consumption, and then it falls off like a cliff. And for centuries, even millennia, this work can remain as it is, virtually untouched, with little need for continuing energy input. Whereas if you're talking about, say, we were talking about sculpture that could be made quickly, if you're talking about, say, Damien Hirst's basketballs, which were essentially production Spalding basketballs that were suspended in these cases. These works take millions of dollars to sustain in a sustainable curatorial environment. First of all, the materials are not enduring, and they have to be in a vacuum in order to do that. And all of this requires constant energy input. And to maintain something like that really requires this continuous investment of energy. So while casting in bronze, yes, a lot of energy at the top, but then nothing after that. Whereas working in an impermanent material, maybe the energy input is relatively green or minimal, but the sustained tail is so long and so high, and in many works actually does not fall off, but actually increases. As the work gets older, it needs more and more investment of energy.
Do you, as part of that, think about the energy in terms of people's engagement with the artwork? So I'm thinking about when a sculpture or any piece of work is installed, say publicly, it will attract initially a lot of interest. People will think, oh gosh, what's that? I haven't seen that before. But then, as they go about their daily lives and might walk past it twice a day, perhaps that initial interest will decline. I suppose that could be tied into this half-life or term of long art in general.
That's a cultural aspect of visual art, that at first it has an impact. Maybe it's shock, maybe people like it, maybe they hate it. People have strong reactions to art in general, not always positive. That's okay, because art is not ever going to please everybody, no matter what you do. There will always be dissonant voices. That's just the nature of ideas. When art is first introduced, it has an impact, positive or negative, but people will react. And then it becomes part of the scenery. You take it for granted. What was once novel becomes part of our built environment. And then sometimes, once it is truly integrated, it becomes part of our lives.
Yeah. There
are many wonderful examples all over the world of artworks which are iconic for a community or people actually engage with. I have these various artworks in various places in the world that I literally consider them touchstones. When you go to the marketplace in Florence, there's a sculpture that's a reproduction of a wild boar that was there traditionally. And you go there and the nose is absolutely almost gone. This is the cingale, the wild boar. And if you go to the market, you must touch the boar's nose. This is good luck. And so when you go there and you see this sculpture, you also understand that you're connected across 1,000 years of people touching the sculpture. And this kind of thing is essentially one of the most beautiful forms of performance art I think there is. And not every artwork can become integrated with use that way. But one of the great advantages of artworks that are made with traditional materials is because they are so stable, because they are so strong and durable, they can interact over time long enough and sustain long enough that they can become more than just the built environment, but the performative environment of people. The people's lives can become connected to them. And this is a great accomplishment for art when it happens.
And it's interesting when the opposite happens. I don't know if you're aware of the contested heritage debate here in the UK, which is essentially when historic objects, statues, for example, places, buildings, and the kind of associated stories and meanings that are attached to those objects have become challenged. And the most recent example of that was the statue of Edward Colston, a slave trader, was toppled in Bristol. It was dragged down by people as part of this wider movement, which is a strong contrast, I think. You think of bronze, which is, I think, what the statue is made of, as being very stable and, it's been there for years and years. And yet the kind of cultural movement of the time disturbs that, which I found very, very interesting on many different levels.
Well, really, if you think about it, the force of history is the constant toppling of empires. Public artworks are utilized to manifest the power of the state or the church or the people. And these powers, these empires, they are temporal. They do not last forever. So monuments made to people who engaged in practices which are no longer acceptable, whether they're religious practices or, in the case of slavery practices, will ultimately have their noses broken off and will ultimately be toppled. And this has been happening for thousands of years. Civilizations wash over each other and they displace the gods and the rulers and the czars and the Caesars. And that is part of the inevitable story. And it's important to also preserve in a good context for civilization to look back on these and say, okay, we understand Nero was bad, for instance, and we also are fascinated by how he was bad and how the terrible things he did have continued to pop up across civilization. And this is also a warning.
I know, it's a really good point. I wondered actually, what kind of interpretation do you have alongside your work? For example, your installation in Venice, because we talked about the various strands and the meaning, the inspiration behind the work. And I'm curious to know how much of that you share with the audience, or how much you allow them to find their own meaning in it.
Well, I think one of the wonderful things about doing visual art is that you can take it in pretty much instantaneously. It is perhaps the most immediate form of communication that humanity has ever created, where a person with no background walks in and sees something and has a reaction. And I'm always fascinated, actually, by people who are not in the arts, who will constantly say to me, I don't know anything about art, but I know this or that, or I like this or that. And for me, it says such a beautiful thing about humanity. Making art is possibly part of our early speech, and it's a language we've never given up. And a lot of people are taught to believe they don't know how to speak art, but it's not true. Everybody does, because everybody has an opinion, which means they already get a message, because you can't have an opinion if you haven't received a message. And so I think I've kind of gone off on a tangent from your question, so do forgive me, but I would say that I embrace all interpretations. I always try to make my interpretations available, but I don't want to force feed anybody my opinion about art, because why I'm doing it is to make them look at it, make them see, and make them have this reaction. Like, wow, okay, that is this. And this is what I think it's about. And people will come to you constantly as an artist and say, well, I know you said it's about this, but I really see it's about that. I think it's fantastic. I mean, like, what could be better? What could possibly be better than people taking what you've created and making their own story with it?
That's a very intriguing point, leading to a question a bit provocative. I want to come back to your central issue to our central issue at Idle Spaces, which are ideal spaces in the sense of both imagined spaces and ideal in a utopian, perfected sense. Your genuine approach to art could be a possibility to apply your approach to what we do in Idle Spaces.
I have to say, Ulrich, that I was very excited when you contacted me about Ideal Spaces, and I really enjoyed going through your projects and to see the intersections of our approaches and ideas. I know you've been working on it a long time. I've been working with the concept of long art since the 80s, actually. And one of the things that I love about where we are right now in history is that when I first started talking about these things decades ago, everybody thought I was absolutely crazy. But now people are beginning to resonate. And I think you're probably seeing a similar arc of people beginning to really consider what you're talking about. This is very gratifying, and it's also very exciting for you, I'm sure, and for me to reach across, an ocean and find people with like-minded interests and ideas. So in the regard of ideal spaces, long art in the architectural term is an addition to an architectural program, where you have the program of ideal spaces, creating spaces that work for the people, that express important and history-tested ideas in the creation of new public space, which is something that long art loves, because in long art, what we're doing is we're looking at the historical record of how art is made, which cannot ignore how the art that is made is used. So this is a wonderful kind of confluence of two complementary ideas. And I see great potentials for intersection of bringing these ideas together. And I find it very exciting. Long art would say that, you would create something out of materials that are lasting, that you would try to create spaces that were both enduring and also culturally significant and that people could relate to. And with ideal spaces, I would say that you are trying to accomplish similar things. My program is coming at it from the art making aspect, your program at it from the architectural conceptualizing, grand planning aspect. But, the historical record is absolutely full of successful intersections of those two things. We can travel the great cities of the world and find these world heritage sites which express exactly what we're talking about. And I think that one of the things that's happened is that a lot of those elements of the program that we're talking about with long art and with the ideal spaces of combining the historical and the quality of workmanship and the heirloom aspects and the acculturated aspects have been shed for just innovation. And what I would love to see is I would love to see innovation continue, but let's bring in those other things. That's how we create the next World Heritage Site.
It's a very good perspective. In my eyes, it's a very promising one, giving hope and strength in the daily work. Last but not least, this is important.
Yeah, I'm very excited to think about what's possible. And, I really love the idea that we are not yet done creating true beauty that can serve people.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it? Combining heritage and history with new ideas. It could be applied to, I suppose, any craft or any, aspect of art, whether you're doing printmaking or you're a sculptor. It's how you bring in this inspiration, the traditions into something very modern that you're doing in the present. How does that kind of filter into any teaching that you do, with students or young people? Has that become quite an important thing to pass on, that kind of messaging?
There's actually two answers in your question. So let me take the last one first, and then I want to loop back. So for me, one of the great things that I love and gives me tremendous hope is teaching emerging artists, young art students, young thinkers in general. I deal a lot with peers who are, I would say, a bit pessimistic about younger generations. I feel completely different. I'm very impressed with many of the young people that I've had the privilege to work with and teach and interact with. And I find them to be a constant source of new energy, new ideas. I like to be challenged, and they are willing to do it. And it's, I think, very necessary. One of the advantages that we've all gotten, or many of us have gotten from this period of COVID, was this sort of forced containment with multi-generational households and limiting. And one of the things that I did in my teaching practice was I said, okay, I don't want to stop teaching. So anyone who's going to study with me is essentially going to quarantine in, and then we will just basically function like a family. And I realized when I did it that it was really very similar to like a traditional Renaissance apprenticeship situation where the students live with the master and their lives are intertwined, and essentially it's just a large household. And wow, I learned so much. I hope they learned half of what I learned, because this influx of young people with their ideas, with their agendas, with their concerns, and with their desire to learn it just is incredibly vitalizing. I think that we all need each other and we all bring different gifts to the table. What I can do for another person now in my 60s is different from what I could do for them when I'm in my 20s or in my 40s. And all of those contributions have their significant value. But you were talking about how innovation and long art intersect at the beginning of your question. And I wanted to loop back to that, if you would, because it actually speaks to the project that I'm developing with Ideal Spaces right now for this summer, where we are essentially going to take a Gothic cathedral that has been restored, but lost its traditional embellishment, which is, in the case of the project I'm working on, a ceiling art, which is initially what's called a cartoon, a large drawing that will be the template for a fresco. And unfortunately, I know I'm not going to spend about a year on my back drawing on the ceiling, because we can't do it that way, but we have technology to put my cartoon, which has nothing to do with graphic arts or graphic novels. It's just the old term which has been applied to modern printing. But to put my fresco cartoon on the ceiling using projection. And in this way, this is like a perfect example of long art meeting new innovation and using it to tell stories about our past and find ways to express it in our present and our future.
It is an ideal agenda. And in its basic intention, it meets what we are doing at Ideal Spaces, and in particular, what we want to do with this project. Since the overall topic of this project is the way from a first paradise we lost to a second paradise for a religious mind, to heaven, to the New Jerusalem. Just to take two of the many names given for a place for final redemption we are longing for in the end, no matter if we are religious in the traditional sense or not. It's about these final paradises. As regards your basic idea of participating in this project, I think your cartoon technique as a pre-stage for making a final fresco is a brilliant approach.
Well, thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create an analog of the ceiling, and I'm going to approach the making of the cartoon using traditional heirloom methods and materials, so that the entire gestalt of the piece is in keeping with the time of the basilica when it was created. So I'm going to take hemite, which is a red stone, which also occurs naturally in Germany and in Italy, which is what all the old masters used to draw with. They did not have synthetically made crayons. They drew with stones. And so it will be a smaller version of what would normally be done on the ceiling. Its gestalt, it will nonetheless be that of the basilica. And you were talking about the many interpretations of an ideal religious space. I think we discussed this once before. When you first spoke to me about this holy city, and this, I immediately thought about this wonderful slim volume of Italo Calvino's called Invisible Cities, in which Marco Polo is telling the Khan stories about imaginary cities. And it's the same kind of idea where Your survival is built on your ability to imagine new stories, and in this case, new cities. And this is also, I think, a very beautiful analogy for what you're talking about in this holy city, this ideal space, because we understand that there are problems with the face of the world, that they, first of all, are exclusionary, that everybody is claiming that they have a solution for how to get to paradise. And these solutions are mostly mutually exclusive, which is problematic because there is no good way to test who's right. So you can vote with your heritage and adopt the faith of your people. You can throw over the faith of your people and adopt somebody else's faith. You can invent an entirely new faith. But each of those actions is essentially problematic because there is no way to test for it. And so maybe another way is to just say, we are involved in this constant telling of tales to survive. If you can imagine that, Marco Polo is us and the Aga Khan is the divine being, that we are ensuring our survival by inventing countless and invisible cities, or in this case, ideal religious spaces. It's not about the veracity of any particular religion or any particular description.
Yeah, it is the general image we have in mind in many, many perspectives.
Yeah. And, I think that this is also the same thing with art. There's not a single answer. What's wonderful about art is its multifaceted nature. And that means that everything is possible, including the kinds of things that we're talking about. Ideas of exclusion really only serve the excluders, but they don't serve humanity in general. And everything you limit yourself, it's like we were talking about young people. If I should say, well, here I am, I'm in this point in my career, I don't have interest in wasting time on these young people with their crazy ideas, and I don't want to listen to this stuff, and it annoys me, and I'm just going to do what I'm going to do because I know I'm right. I would miss out on so much. And yes, there is a cost. Everything comes at a price. To be willing to listen to alternative ideas costs you the purity of your own. But that's only if you really believe that your ideas above all others are the only ones worth listening to. And I just don't think that's true. I think what makes us wonderful as creatures on this planet is our ability to find ways to communicate across oceans, across countries, continents. This is our possibility for salvation. And getting back to a point that we were talking about earlier, the best way for us to do this, the one language that I can speak to anybody in the world with, or you can speak to anybody in the world with, is art and architecture. Everybody speaks this language. We all get it. And we don't agree on it, but we can all speak it. It's the language before the Tower of Babel.
Mm. I completely agree with you that art is universal. Everyone will take something from it, even if they claim that they don't know anything about it or they don't know where to start with it. I think there's so much that we've discussed today that I think will resonate with our listeners. Thank you so much, Romolo, for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Yes, I've really enjoyed it. And I look forward to working with you on things with ideal spaces. It's very exciting.
So many thanks. Let us continue cooperating in this project and also in the future.